Welcome to Saltwater Reasonings, a listening library for critical conversation, reflection, and collective knowing across the global South. Today, our conversation is entitled Performing the Ground, Theatre, Memory, and the Caribbean Aesthetic. In this conversation, I am joined by Michelle Hinkson-Cox, an educator, director, and researcher based in Barbados whose work brings theatre and archaeology into direct conversation. We talk about theatre not simply as performance, but as a method of excavation, a method of working with history, a method of making sense of what has been buried, silenced, or misrepresented. Michelle shares how her work moves between archive and memory, between research and spirit, how it holds together history, imagination, and responsibility. This episode asks a central question. What does it mean to create from the ground we stand on when the ground carries memory, violence, and inheritance?
Before we get into who you are and why we're here, when did theatre become your love language, or one of them?
So I'm born into a theatre family. My father is a playwright. And so a lot of people assume that, because daddy's a playwright, he's one of the forerunners of theatre in Barbados, that I came up under him, but I didn't. I had very little knowledge of my dad's work until I actually went to Trinidad. And our dear Rawle Gibbons was the person that introduced me to my father's work. I did study theatre in Barbados at the associate degree level under Dr. Yvonne Weeks. But I think that it's really in Trinidad that my love for theatre was cemented.
You get to Trinidad to university, and Rawle Gibbons, who is a playwright, a director extraordinaire, retired now, but past director of the Department for Festival and Creative Arts. You said he introduced you to your father's work.
Yeah,
What was
yes,
that like?
he did. We were sitting in Caribbean Drama and Society, so we were talking about theatre in the islands. I knew that my dad was involved in theatre, but I did not have a real understanding of the extent of his involvement. I didn't know that he was known across the region in that generation of artists. I just thought he was a drama teacher at secondary school. So we were sitting in the class and Rawle was talking about different practitioners. And then he said, and we have like a princess of theatre from Barbados here. I am kind of looking around the room like, who else in here is from Barbados? And he says, yes, Anthony Hinkson is one of the. I was like, who? I had no idea. I came to learn then about what my father really has done in theatre in Barbados over the years since then. And then Daddy also became one of my mentors. I did not want to take on my father's legacy. I wanted to make my own way. I felt like, I didn't want to get jobs in theatre because people knew I was his daughter. I actually had a pseudonym so that I would not be directly associated with my dad. I didn't want to hang on to his coattails. I wanted to make my own way. I wanted to get work in theatre based on merit and not nepotism. Rawle really introduced me to the work that my father had done. Hearing him speak about my father's work, because I'd actually never seen any of it. I'd never been to any of his plays. I'd never gone out to anything that he ever did in theatre. So then to hear somebody else speaking about it was a little shocking for me, to say the least. But I always said, that's all right. Daddy made his mark as a writer and director. I don't want to do those two things. I am going to stay away from that because I want to chart my own path. And now here I am as a writer and director.
But still charting your path. Interesting, because your doctoral work combines archaeology and theatre. And archaeology is about excavation and finding things. And it's all about charting a new path. So when you think about that excavation, though, that coming into your father's work from Barbados through Trinidad, like what is the sensation in your body when you think of that?
It is very kind of warm, because Daddy and I were not close when I was growing up. And it is really through the experience of being in Trinidad and being around Rawle and Louis in particular that drew me closer to my father's work. I'm closer to my father in essence. So when I think about Trinidad, for me, I'm born and raised in Barbados, but Trinidad is where I grew up. You know, I always tell people that it is where I came to know more of myself, came to question more of myself as well.
Yeah.
You know, so it is a very warm and fuzzy sensation.
So you've come to this cross-disciplinary focus on theater studies and archaeology. Tell me about your path and what got you here.
So I have to go back to 2009. I was doing my master's in the UK, and the master's was in applied theater or applied drama. You know, shout out to Dani.
Yeah.
That was really Dani Lyndersay's influence, taking that path. And I was in the UK studying, and for my final term, we had to do an internship. And I was looking at the list of organizations that they had, and I was like, I don't want to work in prisons. I don't want to work with a women's group. Nothing was jumping out at me except this one property, which was a National Trust property in South London. And I didn't know why exactly it hit me because I was not a history student. So the thought of actually working within history for me was kind of weird because it was not something that I'd ever done. I wanted something that would have been new and challenging, and I went to work in National Trust. And we had a project called London Voices at this property, this lovely property that has been through Victorian times and Georgian times and Elizabethan times. And there's like so much richness in the space. And the entire project was about how do we get these children from a nearby primary school in the community to engage with their history in the space. So they came to the property. We used art modes. A lot of it was visual arts or craft. So, like one of the exercises, for instance, there was this large painting of this woman who we call Georgia. To this day, I don't know if that's her name, but it's a Georgian painting. So I guess it works. But we called her Georgia, and you know, it was in this kind of a tea room. So we had the children come in, and we did a tea party in the room with the children. And a part of the participation for the children was that their parents had to be there with them. So it was an intergenerational activity. And they did all kinds of things. We had a tea party. They ended up designing family crests for each family, all these different like art interventions to get you to understand your history. So, you know, like, okay, fine, the idea was peaked. And my research paper, my dissertation back then was community performance in museums and heritage sites in Barbados. So I came home, I started going into spaces here that I'd never looked at from that perspective. And that is where it was kind of birthed. When I moved back home, the project dropped. You know, you get back home and then the reality of life hits you. So I ended up with family and all these things, but then I was working at the National Cultural Foundation of Barbados. I was their theater arts coordinator. And in 2014, and this is where it gets really funny to me, right? Remember, I was trying to avoid my father's legacy. In 2014, because for crop over, we would normally have what we call a folk concert, which is the one theater presentation during the crop over season. And one of my father's students, Mercy Boyce, who himself is a titan in theater in Barbados now. Dorsey was working at the foundation at the time, and he was the producer for Crop Over that year. So Dorsey looked at me and he said, "Hey, your father is a playwright. Write the play." What?
Wow.
Write the play. So I was like, but it's like you don't download it from the Matrix. It's what do you mean? Write the play? Like, okay. So I kind of took a pause and I called my dad. And because the play had to be based on our 1937 riots, which is a historical thing. So I said to my dad, "Do you have anything?" Because Daddy's a poet as well. I said, "Do you have anything that I can use as material to help me figure out how to write this play?" And in 2014, I wrote my first play, and it was a play done by my father and myself together. He mentored me through the process. The script was mine, but it incorporated his poetry. And it was really quite a fantastic experience because I then understood how to marry the history and the theater. I was in the library, like looking through archives, newspaper clippings, and then it was 1937, so my grandparents would have been alive back then. They were still alive at the time in 2014. So I was talking to them and getting that oral history account of what happened in 1937. And that's where my love for this kind of historical theater came up. But the other interesting thing was that this crop over, I met the deputy director of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society, Kevin Farmer. And I met him at the launch of Crop Over. So when I was telling him about, this process that I'm going through trying to write this play, he's like, that's really interesting, history and theater. I'm like, yeah, I think so too. But, I have to wait and see where it goes. I told him about the experience that I had at the National Trust property. And we were just about to go into International Museums Day. And he said, well, why don't you do something at the museum? And I thought, okay. And we did, that movie, Night at the Museum?
Yes.
I kind of took that concept and ran with it from a theatrical perspective. So I had everyone come in at night into the museum, and we developed what we call the torchlight tours. So all the lights in the museum were off. People were using flashlights, their phone lights to view the exhibits. And when they thought they were viewing the exhibits, what they were actually viewing would have been performers in the space. So we had people dressed in costume. Some of them were actually in the exhibit spaces that you're not allowed to go into, because some of the exhibit spaces you have to look from outside in. And we had people inside moving around. So we did a lot of training for the actors to understand how to navigate a space with priceless artifacts, and it was really quite a journey. We went from kind of just interpreting what was there to then saying we want to begin to interpret Barbadian stories. So from 2014 till now, we have been working with the Barbados Museum. They are the absolute chief supporters of my work in museum theater. In fact, it was the director of the museum that wrote my recommendation to get the scholarship to study at the University of Glasgow. So they have been like 100% supportive of everything that I've been doing. But that's where that journey began, with the Barbados Museum inviting me into their space and saying, it's open to you, let's play. That's what it was. They have never once questioned anything. Like, everything that I've done has been very much like, you want to do what? Okay, do it.
Here you go.
Yeah, just do it. Go ahead, have fun. So we are constantly working with them, and they've opened the doors for me in a lot of ways to do other projects as well, and to get exposure with groups like ICOM, the International Council of Museums, St Andrews University in Scotland. We just finished a project with them, which actually won an international prestigious award a couple of weeks ago. So the museum really has been pushing me as well in this kind of work. I have to shout out Kay Hall. Kay Hall is the Education and Community Outreach Officer at the museum. And she is an amazing woman who, like, everything that happens, she's like, right, this can work for your PhD. How are we going to make this work for your PhD? This project is happening. Make it happen with your PhD. So she's really been amazing in helping me to figure out the scope of what I can do within the context of the PhD and the work here in Barbados.
So such an amazing story. I want if we can start to excavate a little bit. So first of all, there's legacy. We've talked about Rawle Gibbons. You mentioned Louis McWilliams, and I wanted to just have a few minutes just talking about Louis and his work, how that has shaped you. You mentioned Dani Lyndersay, who is a pioneer in applied theater in the Caribbean. And you also mentioned going home and having all of these supporters and people say, hey, how can I make this happen for you? So I want us to talk about the mentors. I want us to talk about the people who have showed up and how community has fueled your work. And I wanted to talk about the research, your method, and what there's to learn from that. So let's start with the mentors and the people who have really inspired you and supported you.
Yeah. There are a number of people. In Trinidad, it is those three people, Paul, Louis, and Dani. I think Dani is very special to me. Very, very special. Not only because of the Applied Theatre Trust, but we also share the same birthday, so we're like birthday sisters.
Yes.
But Dani, I knew of Rawle and I knew of Louis, because when I said I was moving to Trinidad to study, my dad said, look out for Rawle and Louis. But then there are other people here who said to me, look out for Dani. But when I got to Trinidad, I think Dani she wasn't there at the time. I think she came in a semester later or something like that. She was away for a bit.
Yeah.
And when she came back, we just connected. There was something about Dani's energy and her spirit that resonated with me. I was going through so much at the time as well, trying to figure out. I'm in Trinidad. Trinidad was already a familiar space to me. I've been visiting for years. I have family there, so it was not an unfamiliar space. But this idea of doing theater in Trinidad just felt so foreign. And Dani she was really quite a good mentor in that sense. We had a lot of, one-on-one conversations trying to navigate that space. But Rawle and Louis' style of theater really is what has shaped my work here. Dani from a production perspective, so I've learned production from Dani, stage management, the design elements, actual production work. I've learned a lot from Dani. But in terms of my creative practice on stage, that's all Rawle and Louis. This idea of theater being a collaborative process and not trying to be a dictator as a director, but understanding that everyone brings something into that process. And of course, the mantra, everybody knows the mantra from Louis, trust the process.
Trust the
We all know
process.
it. Trust the process. But their style of working is something that has shaped me as a practitioner. Understanding total theater, understanding that we as Caribbean people can bring our voices or music or rhythms or movements or nuances that make us Caribbean and infuse that into the work. So we don't have to do Western style theater. We don't have to stick to Western forms of theater, Western conventions, chart our own path. And I think that is a lot of what I've been doing with the work here as well. When I went to England, I met with the course convener at the time, Kiva McAvinci, lovely Irish lady. And again, Kiva reminded me so much of Dani. She had that calming but sprightly energy. But then there's another lady who really helped to shape me, and she's the one that pushed me into the museum theater, Sue Mayo. And Sue was up to now, Sue will still message me and, have a conversation with me online or post up what I'm doing and say, Goldsmiths graduate, because she really was there championing the whole move towards doing work in the history sector and the museum sector. So the two of them were very instrumental in kind of shaping what I wanted to do within the context of applied theatre. But certainly in Barbados, the staff at the museum, they have been so wonderful. They've actually made themselves available to me. So my process is, I don't think it is complex, but when I start to talk about it, people tell me it sounds complex. But to me, it feels natural because I will have an idea. I'll give you an example. I wrote a play called Millie Gone to Brazil. Millie Gone to Brazil is actually a Barbadian folk song. We sing it from primary school all the way up. Everybody knows it. Generations upon generations of people know it. And we sing it happily. It's a really fun song.
Yeah.
Here are the lyrics to the song, Tracy. Millie gone to Brazil, Lord, poor Millie. Millie gone to Brazil, Lord, poor Millie. With the wire wrapped round she waist and the razor cut up she face. Millie down in the well, oh Lord, poor Millie. The
Right.
song is actually about domestic murder. And we sing this as children. Happy, like everybody's singing and clapping and nobody's thinking about what these words actually mean. And it is a true story that happened in 1916. So it's not that far removed in context of history, right? And at the museum one year, we said, you know what, let's tell the story of this song because we need to understand that, yes, we have these folk songs that we sing, but all the folk songs have meanings. We did the thing, and a couple of years after, another historian here, Dr. Frederick Aline, did some research on the same case. And he found all of the actual court documents with the testimonies and everything. I went back to the play. I went to Dr. Aline. I said, can I use your research material and credit you? Because I now want to go back to this play because this is new material that I hadn't found when I was doing the original research. He was quite happy to do it. And I was like, fantastic support. So I rewrote the play, took it back to Dr. Aline and said to him, can you read it? Because you've done the research as a historian, and I want to make sure that what I write as an artist is an accurate representation of the research as far as possible, but also that I haven't veered too far from the story because I want to honor the people who are involved in the story. So my process is that kind of back and forth between the art and the history, the art and the archaeology. How does one thing speak to the other? And for me, that's critical because when you're dealing with history, in a lot of cases, you're not working with people who can speak for themselves, can't talk for themselves. So you have to make sure that you are not only honoring their memory, but being as truthful as possible. And it's particularly critical for me because my doctoral research focuses on transatlantic slavery, so there's no oral history that I can do to talk to anybody and get an account on that. And what is wonderful about University of Glasgow, where I'm based, is that they are embracing my process. They don't necessarily understand my process because for me, the process is also largely spiritual. And it is the first time that, from an academic perspective, I've been able to use spirituality to help define what I'm doing and have it accepted as a part of academia. So, we have the largest enslaved burial ground here in Barbados in the Western Hemisphere at Newton. And there are times that I have just gone and I sat at Newton and I've allowed the space to speak to me. I've allowed, the ancestral energy in that space to speak to me. And then I would write poetry. And I would go back to my supervisors and say, hey, I went to Newton, look what I found. And they're like, oh my God, you have to include that in your research. So then literally there's this merging of all of my different selves. So there is the artistic side. There's the side that is very interested in archaeology, but there's also the side that is very much spiritually connected to the energy of the ancestors here. We did an archaeological dig some years ago with Matthew Riley and some visiting students from the US. And one of the things that we found was just a shard of clay. And, that's nothing unusual. To be honest, the entirety of Barbados was probably like one massive plantation because we don't have space. So everywhere you turned, it was a plantation in Barbados. And to find things like clay is not unusual. But this one particular piece of clay, it struck a chord with me spiritually because in the clay was a fingerprint embedded in it. So that is somebody's fingerprint from that period. It was this moment where I felt like, okay, when I put my hand on this piece of clay and on this fingerprint, the knowledge that I am touching you, I'm touching this person that put their print in this.
Yeah.
And so there's been a very heavy, very, very heavy spiritual component for me. It has moved me to tears at some points because when you really sit down and you assess some of the things that have happened in that period, it's not something that, like with Millie Gone to Brazil, you can just sing a folk song and forget the meaning of it. It is now bringing that meaning to the fore. And that's what I'm trying to do by merging the archaeology and the theatre. Because we know that this period happened. We know about the horrors of enslavement in the Caribbean, but we don't know about it. And unfortunately, Tracy, you and I may go to, a seminar, a historical seminar. The average person is not going to go and sit down and listen to any lecture. They're not going to go to a genealogy session. They're not going to go to those things, but they will come to watch theatre. So this is my way of saying, let's now bring our history, our heritage as well, out to that wider public.
Your work is so exciting. And I have many questions. Let me figure out where I want to start. The idea of ancestral presence being data, maybe that's one point that stands out for me. And that resonates with my work because ancestral presence is always part of the work
Yeah.
that we do. And so often in academic pursuits, we're taught or told to separate knowledge from ancestral knowledge, which is a whole different type of epistemology that we don't make space for. So you're making space for ancestral presence as data, taking that data, using the body to translate that data into poetry and theatre and community, and maintaining that commitment also to community theatre, right? So theatre's archaeology makes sense to us.
Yes. Yeah.
It makes sense. It might seem like separate things.
Yeah, because every time I say it, people are like, theater, archaeology, theater in itself is an artifact. And what I've been trying to push, my work is focusing on that particular period of time. But I'm using the archaeological process and the rigor of archaeology because when they find a piece of clay, it's not just a piece of clay. They have to go through rigorous testing and dating and everything to then ascribe meaning to that, to say it's come from the 18th century as opposed to the 19th century. So there's such a process involved in the archaeology for them to get meaning. And I'm saying to people, from the context of theater, we also have to apply that rigor.
And it's a different kind of rigor. It connects back to the people who you credit as the foundation for a lot of the work that you're doing. Because when you look at the work of Rawle Gibbons, you look at McWilliams and what he's done with Calypso and history. Theatre is archaeology, and it's always been a dig. And the process of doing work has always been a dig. And then when we think about Dani Lyndersay and her commitment to applied theatre, I see those threads. I guess that's why it feels like a natural fit for us.
It
Yeah.
does. And that's what I will always say. I grew up in Trinidad. Trinidad is the place where a lot of who I am personally, spiritually, professionally, all of that really kind of started to take shape. I don't think that I would be where I am now if I was not at CCFA.
Center for Creative and
Yeah,
Festival.
at the center,
Yeah.
yep, that Gordon Street. We were at Destiny Street.
Oh, right. Yes.
Yeah,
There've been so many manifestations. For me, it was the Creative Arts Center.
exactly.
The other thing that jumps out at me, and I had a question about performance as a way of uncovering what is hidden, what is displaced, and what is silenced in the Caribbean. And when you speak about your work, that comes up. When I'm thinking about the folk song that's about femicide, I think a lot of times the way in which Caribbean people carry out pain, it's tied up in humor and metaphor.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's so easy to take it for granted or to even misunderstand why this thing will be comical, but there's so many layers of pain in that. What have you continued to unpack around that as you've done this work?
The unpacking for me really comes with my students because a lot of my work is done with them. So let me take a step back. So my PhD is focusing on playwriting specifically. So the output of my PhD is going to be a play. And I'm in the process of writing that play now. And I did a bit of a preview of it in October. Again, Barbados Museum Deputy Director Kevin Farmer, who is also the Executive Secretary of the Codrington Trust. And Codrington Trust is connected to Codrington College here in Barbados, which was very much involved in the activities around transatlantic slavery. So they're now looking at it as, okay, from the trust perspective, you can't really correct the wrongs because it's been done. But how do you kind of repair? We talk a lot about the reparation and the repatriation and those things. So they're involved in that. They had a conference here in October and they wanted a performance. And I said, well, if you want a performance, no problem. I'm going to perform an extract from the play that I'm doing for my thesis. It was about an hour-long performance. My students were the ones that were on stage. It was immersive. So again, typical Rawle Gibbons, Louis McWilliams style. So it was not in a conventional theatre space. It was outside in a garden. And I wasn't directing it. I like to take a step back. I like to write the play and I have someone, kind of like how Rawle has Louis, I have a director as well, Nala. So I stepped back and I watched Nala direct these students. And one day I said to them, do y'all understand what it was to be in the hole of a slave ship? And they're like, yeah, it was close, it was tight, it was this, very superficial understanding. And I said, well, y'all use Chat GPT so much. Use it now. Go on Chat GPT and just say, give a graphic description of what it was like for the African people to be in the whole of a slave ship. And ChatGPT delivered for them. When they came back, some of them were in tears. You know that it was cramped conditions, but when you think about the fact that there are feces around you, when you think about the fact that there is nowhere to urinate, there is nowhere, you can't turn. There are dead people right next to you or sick people, and the smell. ChatGPT went like further than I would have gone, to be honest. They went real far. And the students kind of took a step back and it changed their entire performance because they were able to then say, look, this is what my ancestors went through. And then there's the other layer where some years I have students who are either white or mixed race, and they then have to kind of wrangle with the idea of what their ancestors would have done. So there are all these different layers that we kind of have to unpick in the process itself. So before the work even gets to the stage, I usually have to work with the actors to get them to do that excavation of their own, to understand where they sit, where their history is, because then they have to present that to an audience. It is a process that has ended in tears. It has ended in some cases with actors just sitting very quietly because how do you respond? We've been using the runaway slave ads, and when you look at the ads, they will say things like, she had a mark above her chest, and it was like she was branded. And when they began to kind of understand the things that are not said, right? How does this man who's supposed to be a slave owner know about the gap between this woman's thighs? How do you know that? You can only know that if you've seen it. So they began then to unpick those things. All of that is a part of the process for me. It is a delicate part of the process. I usually have to do some psychological work with them because you are bringing up so many different types of emotions in that moment, and you have to be able to manage that. So, we do have to pay very close attention to that, because if the emotions are coming up for the actors, we also know that they can come up for the audience. And we presented that play at the conference, and the conference was mixed audience, including white Europeans, and a lot of them sat very uncomfortable, and I was unapologetic about it. Because if we can come across in the whole of a slave ship in those conditions, you can sit and watch this uncomfortably for 1 hour, because
Yeah.
this is our story. And my issue is always that we hear one side. We hear the side that's written in the history books, but then who's writing the history books? So it is I don't want to call it a burden, but it often feels like a burden
Yeah.
to sit and to uncover, to uncover, to uncover, but also to treat with respect. And it is a very, very heavy burden, Tracy. It is, there are times that just had to come home. I tell my kids, guys, don't talk to mommy right now. Just let me simmer.
The emotional labor of doing the work, and I'm hearing in the excavation, there's making room for spirit to be present.
Yes.
And those things make people uncomfortable. As you were speaking, there are so many levels of the excavation of discomfort.
Yeah.
Yours, the actors, the community, the diversity of the community, being unapologetic and honoring ancestral presence.
Yes. It's a lot. It's a lot, but it's something that I can't. I've tried. I've really tried to go the opposite direction, and every time I try to move away from it, it just kind of pulls me right back. And I think at some point you have to recognize that, well, for me at least, there is no real separation between the spiritual and the academic. There's no real separation. One informs the other, and there's a lot of full circle moments for me. Even now, I mean, my legal name is Michelle Cox, but I've been using Michelle Hinkson-Cox now for about 10 years. And that for me was that moment of saying, I need to stop running from my father's legacy. I put his name back there, and it was a moment for me because I have a cousin in the US who's a retired professor. And in his retirement, he's decided he wants to do a family tree. So he's been sending me all of this information. And a part of what he's found would have been the actual names of our ancestors that came across Scotsmen and the names of the slaves, the numbers of slaves that they brought with them. So then I also have to recognize that a part of my ancestry was also an oppressor. And to kind of put all that information together, yeah, I have to treat it with a certain level of respect, but it is a spiritual journey as well. Yeah.
As you're speaking, I think one of the things that make people sometimes think that archaeology and theater are so removed from each other is that one, there's the absence of the body in one and the presence of the body in the
Yeah.
other.
Yeah.
You can't do theater without a body. Archaeology doesn't have a body at all. And it feels as though your work is creating that performance landscape, is connecting ruins,
Yeah.
memories, and is reinserting the
Yeah.
body in the history.
Yeah. Because the output of archaeology, you don't see the archaeologists who are doing the digs. So you don't actually see them. You know that somebody must have uncovered it, but you don't see who that person is. But even that for me was a part of the process that I had to sit down and process myself, because what I was seeing was white hands uncovering Black history.
Let's talk about that metaphor there.
Yeah, it's exactly that. And they are treating it so delicately, and they are good people. So they understand the contradictions and the difficulties in their positioning as not only being white, but being white and non-Barbadian. They're visiting Barbados. But the reality is, as someone who's from here and I'm standing on and I'm watching, what I'm seeing is white hands uncovering Black history. I'm like, no, hold on. We've been here before. We've been here before. the books have already been written by white hands. How about we now have some black hands mixing themselves in that dirt? There are times that I will just literally go to some of these key sites and just take off my shoes, feel the presence of the earth, put my hands in the ground, because that is our history. A lot of the poetry that I've written was literally just that visceral experience of being in these different spaces. The not just the contradictions, the questioning, the revelations that come from it. Very simple things that we don't think about on a day-to-day basis. Like, there was one day that it hit me, the same sun that I'm standing under witnessed the horrors of slavery. The same sun, the sun hasn't changed. And just things like that. And sometimes I would stand in the sun and feel the heat of the sun on my skin and think, how must this have felt to them? Because I have the freedom of saying, I'm going to go stand in the shade or I'm going to go drink a glass of water. I have that freedom. They didn't. Or in some cases, they had to stay and just continue working with the sun beating on their backs. And it's just those very simple things that we don't think about that make it hit home to you. This is what our ancestors had to go through.
So Esther Amar, who is on an episode of this reasoning, her work is on emotional justice, and she talks about emotional inheritance, the layers of things we carry in our body, and we inherit emotion. And a lot of them we will never physically know. We don't even know the burdens of these for parents, not just what they experience
Yes.
physically, but what they experience emotionally. And those things are like buried in our DNA. So when you talk about those white hands excavating our history, there are limits to what they can excavate because the emotional inheritance of enslavement lives in our systems and structures, but it also lives in our bodies. And that's in our bloodline. Yeah. And so the data is being channeled from that as well.
So I have two primary supervisors, Michael Bachman, who is a German theater practitioner. So a lot of his work focuses on, the Jewish Holocaust. And while we know there's a lot of conversation that you can't compare the Holocaust to transatlantic slavery, there are some things academically that one can kind of feed into the other in terms of the research process. But my other supervisor I call her my fire starter. She is a Black Haitian American woman. She's an archaeologist. So she's really been very instrumental for me because her name is Peggy Brunash. Peggy, because I don't have a background in archaeology and history academically. So she's been really guiding me from that perspective. And one of the things that she said to me that really stood out was be careful not to get trapped in trauma porn. As she said, remember that there are people, there are actual people. So, in as much as yes, we're going through an absolutely horrific time here, they still may have had stories of love, of joy, of happiness. They would have had jokes among themselves. There would have been situations where the Obeah man had to mix a little bush tea for Massa or Massa wife. There are those other stories that are not necessarily rooted in violence and blood and gore. And to be able to also excavate those stories and to show that, what, there was horror in that period, but there's also beauty in that period. The beauty of resilience, the beauty of their strength, the beauty of their ability to retain and in some cases mask elements of the culture that they brought with them from the mainland Africa. So I'm making sure that I kind of have that balance because I don't want that people read the work and come away going, yeah, the boy did the suffer. Yeah, we did suffer, but we also had moments of beauty within the suffering that we were able to say, okay, this is our strength, this is our
Yeah.
love, this is our endurance. And those are some of the more positive stories as well that I'm trying to also excavate. We still feel it. And when we live in these small islands in the Caribbean, we are still, most of us, in a plantation economy. We still see the actual remnants of that system of colonialism. Even if we are independent nations, republic nations, that's great, but we can still see that trickle down effect of what transpired through colonialism and transatlantic slavery.
I do think, though, that Michelle, joy is also part of that emotional inheritance, because as you
Yes,
said, ancestors
yes,
were whole people, and it trickles down in the way that we still laugh, and sometimes at very painful things as well.
yes, absolutely.
And that emotional inheritance is not just the trauma of enslavement, but the resilience, the
Yeah,
survival, the fact that people had whole lives, people fell in love.
yeah, yes.
People get horn.
and
People,
people get horn. People
you
gotta
know.
deal with the horn, and that's the reality of it, and I think a lot of the times we forget that. We forget that we're talking about real people with real stories. And I think that is where I get to take my creative license,
Mm,
because the archaeology is not necessarily going to show you those stories.
yes.
The archaeology is not going to show you how one person loved another so much. It's not going to show you those things, but we can then begin to imagine and to build and to create. And a large part of that imagination for me comes from that spiritual connection. So I'm not imagining out of a vacuum. For me, it is like communion. I'm communing with the ancestors, and then I'm sharing what I get from them.
So that importance of imagination, and I just had a reasoning with a geographer. And feminist geographers talk about the Caribbean region having a geography of grief. And Zara Simone talks about the importance of imagination. And imagination is not to make it something far off and impossible, but using imagination to excavate. I want to ask you about the role of imagination as an excavation tool in your work. What are you learning in that process, and how has that been revealing itself to you?
It's been interesting. I do a lot of free writing, and just allow the writing to speak without me trying to overthink it, which is often very difficult for us as
Yeah.
academics. But um, a lot of free writing to just allow the imagination to flow. And for me, the imagination comes in several different ways. So because again, collaborative process is important for me. So I will write, and I will often take my writing then to sometimes to my director, sometimes to my students, and we would have discussions, and I allow them to kind of feed into my imagination as well, because they also have different perspectives. But imagination as a methodology, and then because for me it is tied in with the spirituality. So it is not just, I can imagine how, no, it is a spiritual thing for me. And it's a very difficult process to explain with words. I know that Tracy understands it, but I don't know how to explain it for the other people who are watching this podcast. It is very difficult to actually just put it in words, because there's a spiritual connection. There's a certain level of meditation that goes into it, a certain level of connecting. So the imagination is not in a vacuum for me. It is very much steeped in the spirituality. And it is something that I don't just imagine for the sake of saying, I have creative license as a writer, so I can imagine I'll put anything on the script. It has to be coming from that spiritual experience and from that connection, so that the imagination for me really is more of a revelation of ancestral knowledge. It's a revelation of that spiritual connection. So it is coming from somewhere. There's no real way to put that in words that make sense academically. And I think that is one of the things that I'm sort of jostling with right now. My research is at the University of Glasgow in Scotland. So how do I put this in words that make sense to people who culturally don't necessarily have this experience? I was very naive, because I'm writing about this thing, and then I'm talking about Orisha, I'm talking about ancestors, and then my German supervisor goes, "What?"
Yes.
Doesn't know. So just recognizing that I have to put words to these things for people that are culturally removed from the experiences that I'm talking about. And I'm still trying to figure out, how do I adequately capture that experience? That part I have not figured out yet.
It's going to come.
It is becoming clearer. It's becoming clearer, but it is not quite there yet, because it is still an academic process, the PhD. As much as I am infusing it with theatrical this and spiritual that, it's still an academic process. So I still have to be able to explain it academically, so that hopefully somebody can quote it somewhere down the road.
Yeah, yeah.
There is imagination, but I don't want people to say imagination in a superficial way. It is not flippant. It is not, I went to sleep and I woke up and had an idea. There is a spiritual connection. And so even if I go to sleep and I have an idea, that is coming from a spiritual source. It's not coming from just nowhere. I pay very close attention to dreams, attention to the things that are happening around me. When we did the same when we gone to Brazil play, we produced the rewrite of it last year. And in the middle of rehearsals, another woman was found in a well. And this is I don't want to say a regular thing in Barbados. It is too regular. I mean, once
Yeah.
is too much, right? But it is something that has been happening for decades upon decades upon decades. It's not, that was 1919, that story, but it is not so far removed from us that it's not still happening. That happened last year, right? So for me, when I'm writing this thing, I have to pay attention to the voices of the ancestors. We've just produced an abridged version of that same play for the European Union here in Barbados because they're doing for the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. They're doing the Red Shoes Project, which was a project that was started by an artist in Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're a part of that project. We've produced a 20-minute extract from the play. And so they were trying to figure out how to tie the play back into the Red Shoe Project. And I said, I got you. I got you. Millie's gonna wear red shoes.
There we
And
go.
at the end of it, we're gonna find her shoes by the well. And the actors are gonna say that we're taking these red shoes to the exhibit to honor the memory of Millie and all of the other women who have suffered from domestic abuse and ultimately, in some cases, death. So we've taken the shoes in, we're honoring the memory of Millie and all the other women that would have suffered some kind of domestic abuse. But it can't be that I'm writing that play just for the sake of the creative process. It is spiritual for me. And knowing that this is a true story, we are honoring an actual memory. I can't treat it as just being creative. It has to be spiritual plus the creative plus the historical. All those things have to work together.
So many threads. It's a quilt of so many things because your work is it's serving so many purposes. As we start to close, I want to ask you, what cultural sites or stories for you in Barbados, in your body, still seem unresolved? And what creative questions you have that you have not dug into as yet?
Doing the research for this last performance at Codrington was one of those moments where it's unresolved for me. Because when I was doing the research, I pulled up some minutes from meetings of the Codrington Trust from the 1800s. And in one of the meeting notes, it says that we are thankful to Mr. Hinkson for his work in maintaining order on the plantation. Now, Codrington College is in St. John. My father's family, the Hinksons, are also from St. John. So it is very likely that Mr. Hinkson that they're referring to, we haven't found a first name, but it is more than likely that he is one of my forefathers. And kind of taking that step back and going, wait, how do I now process this other piece of information that takes it away from just being historical to being personal, And that is where I am now kind of trying to, I don't know that there's a balance to be found, but it is a reasoning that I have to do because it is no longer just another story. It is a story that can very well be intimately connected to my family's history. So that's where I am at with that. So Codrington College is the site that is pulling me the most right now. I'm excited in one way because I think the work in itself is exciting, but it is also sobering in another way. It is very sobering, and this is a place of theology. Codrington College is a seminary. This is where we're teaching spirituality at a different level. So it's very sobering for me to be there and to feel the space. I think my students know me by now. Every time I go into a space like that, I walk with my bottle of white rum. I do my libations. I honor the space. I honor the ancestors in that space because I recognize that I am asking permission to do this work. And I don't take that for granted. And I always tell my students, you do not have to be an Orisha practitioner or an Ifa practitioner. You don't have to be practicing in any way, but you do have to honor. You do have to respect. Because when you do this work, these are real people. So that's the thing that I'm really kind of sitting and letting stew in me right now, just recognizing that this is potentially a family story that I'm uncovering. And then I have to be able to divorce myself from the family story academically.
Yeah.
And to write objectively. Like, how do you do that when there is such a personal connection with what is happening?
And do you need to do that? But that's a whole other story. I think there's distance, but subjective experience is also data as well. And to pull on all of those things. This has just been so beautiful.
It has been wonderful.
I have one last question for you.
Yes.
If theater studies and archaeology were to name a shared future methodology for the Caribbean, what might that look like?
I believe one influencing the other. It has to be a symbiotic relationship. So there's no hierarchy for me between the two. Because what I'm saying is, let's use the archaeology to help bring the theatrical information into a space where it is and I use the term very loosely because we know that accuracy is also subjective, but as accurate as it can be, reflecting the history. But at the same time, how can we use the theater to make the archaeology more accessible? So to me, the two are going to be working hand in hand. It is a symbiotic relationship rather than hierarchical. I think that the methodology should look like artists and historian or archaeologists respecting each other's process, but also being involved in each other's process. So it should not be a situation where, as an archaeologist, I say, okay, I want you to do a piece on this. Here, take it and go. I need to be involved in your process. But it is also useful for the theater practitioner to be involved in the archaeological process. That fingerprint in that piece of clay, if I was not there, would not have impacted me if somebody had just told me about it, right? Being in the process makes a difference. And this is where, being a Louis student comes in, because it is the process that's important to me. I don't care. I mean, it would be nice to have a full house of audience. Lovely. But I don't care that much about the audience. I'm sorry. I really care about the people who are in my process, because even if I only have 10 people in my audience, if I have impacted all of these actors, they are going to impact other people. They are going to take this into their work moving forward as well. They're going to begin to question, and then they're also going to begin to produce, right? So I am very, very invested in the process of it, but definitely mutual symbiosis is the thing that I would say, theater and archaeology work together in this region, and not even in this region, beyond. And I'm hoping that this research does not only bear fruit in this context of history and archaeology, it is that question of how can we take difficult histories or represent difficult situations and treat them with care. So it may speak to people in the LGBTQIA plus community. It may be able to speak to, as we did recently, the German internment during World War I. We had German soldiers who were interred in Barbados, German civilians as well, who were prisoners of war. How do we use theater to treat to their story? But difficult histories demand a certain sensitivity, especially when you're doing performance work, because it is a creative process. And how do we make sure that our performance work is staying respectful to that history and to that process and those people that we're representing?
You said, you want the house to be full, but you talk about the actors being your audience. And I started thinking about just the multiple audience. Ancestors are also part of the audience.
Absolutely.
I know we were audience when we were watching Rawle and Louis
Yes.
make work, Dani. We were so part of that audience. And then when you talk about work, and it's in academic context, but it can't betray spirit.
See, it's magical. It is really magical. And I saw the magic for myself firsthand. I think that was 2017. I was doing another play at museum that was looking at some other folk songs, and it was actually a play that was done just before Millie gone to Brazil. The play was called John Belly Mama, which is another folk song here in Barbados. But I wrote the piece, and I always tell people this: every single play that I've written has some element of my family story in it, or a member of my family has been written in as a character. There's always some nugget in there. And when I wrote that play, my grandmother had died a few years before, and the character of John Belly Mama for me was written as my grandmother. I didn't tell anybody anything. And when I gave that actress her costume was a hat that my grandmother used to wear, a dress that my grandmother used to wear. And when she put that on, she became my grandmother. It was magic. And some people came to watch the play from my family. And as soon as they looked at the character, they said, "Oh my God, that's Gran." And it wasn't because of the clothes. It was this actress just embodied my grandmother's behavior, her personality, everything. And I think that's the first time that I realized how deep this can go, where you are embodying ancestors on stage. That was a very safe experience because it was not a traumatic story. But if you are dealing with a traumatic story, then that still has to be
in the forefront of your mind, because if you are embodying and you're pulling back up that traumatic memory, how do you then deal with that? And I think the next step for me is working along with people like yourself. We also have Varia Williams here, who's a creative arts therapist, because you need that psychological support alongside that churning up of traumatic memory. So that's the next step.
What an awesome responsibility we have
Yeah.
as we run this leg.
Yeah.
Responsibility. So all sorts of goodness. Thank you so much for
Thank
sharing
you.
with us.
Thank you. This has been wonderful.
This conversation reminds us that history is not only something we study, it is something we carry. Through theatre, Michelle Hinkson-Cox is working at the intersection of embodiment and imagination. She's bringing histories into spaces where people can encounter them differently, not just intellectually, but emotionally, and sometimes uncomfortably. What stands out is her insistence on care. Care for the people whose stories are being told, care for the actors who must embody these stories, and care for the process itself. Theatre is not only about performance, it is about how we work with difficult stories, responsibly, rigorously, and with integrity. Thank you for listening to Saltwater Reasonings. If you want to learn more about Michelle's work, visit tracyrogers.com/saltwater reasonings. Until the next time, take good care.